It was a stunning announcement. Stunning because of what was said. Maybe equally stunning because it was honest. Secretary of Defense James Mattis says there is no evidence that the Syrian government used sarin gas on its own people. Now, this is a narrative we've been pushing back on for years. So what does this mean for U.S. policy in Syria? And will President Trump continue to push for war in Syria, or will he return to the positions of candidate Trump, who said the U.S. should stay out of it? Let's give it a reality check you won't get anywhere else.
Reality Check with Ben Swan, powered by Dash Digital Cash.
Well, the statement is getting very little media coverage, but it is a very big deal. According to Defense Secretary James Mattis, there is no evidence that the Syrian government has used sarin gas on its own people. Here is exactly what Secretary Mattis told reporters at the Pentagon. Quote, "We have reports from the battlefield from people who claim it's been used." Mattis told reporters at the Pentagon, "We do not have evidence of it. We are looking for evidence of it, since clearly we are dealing with the Assad regime that has used denial and deceit to hide their outlaw actions." Well, Mattis insists that he wasn't refuting the claims, but in a sense, he really did. In 2017, the White House memorandum was quickly produced and then declassified to justify an American Tomahawk missile strike against an airbase in Syria. The justification was used that Assad had used chemical weapons on his own people. Then President Trump himself insisted there was no doubt that Syrian President Assad had killed his own people with banned gases. Listen.
There can be no dispute that Syria used banned chemical weapons, violated its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and ignored the urging of the UN Security Council.
Yeah, but Mattis also did not qualify the statement to just the Syrian airbase strike. And that means that the 2013 gas attack was also not proven to be Assad. At that time, President Obama and Secretary of State at that time, John Kerry, they were demanding Congress approve use of force against Assad. President Obama said this from the Rose Garden as he said American destroyers armed with Tomahawk missiles were on standby in the Mediterranean Sea. Listen.
And I'm prepared to give that order. But having made my decision as Commander-in-Chief based on what I am convinced is our national security interests, I'm also mindful that I'm the president of the world's oldest constitutional democracy.
Now, Congress did not approve that use of force. Then again, Obama did go on to fund and support the Syrian rebels. As for Congress now, they applaud Trump for his use of force. For his part, in this latest statement, Mattis says this, quote, that aid groups and others have provided evidence of the Syrian government using sarin. But as I have extensively reported over the past few years, there is much evidence that those so-called Syrian freedom fighters are actually ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighters, and they're not Syrian at all. And there is evidence that they have used chemical weapons. Other problems with the Assad claim about him using sarin gas: in the 2013 event, the sarin came from homemade rockets, which were favored by insurgents, not the Syrian government. Also, according to Newsweek, in the 2013 event, the White House memorandum seemed to rely heavily on testimony from the Syrian White Helmets, who were filmed at the scene having contact with supposed sarin-tainted casualties, and yet not suffering any ill effects. Carla Del Ponte was unable to fulfill her UN Joint Investigative Mechanism mandate in Syria. She actually withdrew in protest over the United States refusing to fully investigate allegations of chemical weapon use by rebels who were actually jihadis. They were allied with the American effort to oust President Assad, including the use of sarin by anti-Assad rebels. Now, according to the Times of London, Carla Del Ponte, head of the independent UN commission investigating reports of chemical weapon use in Syria, told a Swiss-Italian television station that UN investigators gleaned testimony from victims of Syria's civil war and medical staff, which indicated that rebel forces use sarin gas, a deadly nerve agent. Quote, our investigators have been in neighboring countries interviewing victims, doctors, and field hospitals. And according to their report of last week, which I have seen, there are strong, concrete suspicions, but not yet incontrovertible proof of the use of sarin gas from the way the victims were treated. Del Ponte said in the interview, it was translated by Reuters. Again, quote, this was use on the part of the opposition, the rebels, not by the government authorities, she added. And it was the involvement of those jihadis posing as Syrian rebels that made Then candidate Trump stated emphatically that he would not intervene and help to oust Assad as Hillary Clinton wanted to do. Remember this?
We're nation building. We're trying to tell people that have had dictators and worse for centuries how to run their countries. We have to build our own country. We have to rebuild the United States. And look what's happened in Iraq. We got rid of Saddam Hussein. I don't think that was a very helpful thing. Iraq is a disaster right now, and it's going to be taken over by Iran and ISIS.
Candidate Trump pushed back heavily against intervention. He warned that ISIS was likely to take over Syria if Assad were ousted, just as they have in Iraq and in Libya. And yet, the U.S. is only escalating the fighting. 4 Russian nationals and perhaps dozens more were killed in fighting between pro-government forces in eastern Syria and members of the United States-led coalition fighting against the Islamic State. That's according to Russian and Syrian officials. According to the New York Times, Russia says that no members of its armed forces were actually killed and that any Russians fighting alongside the Syrians were simply mercenaries. So what you need to know is that candidate Trump was clear when he pointed to the Bush policy in Iraq and the Obama-Clinton policies in Libya and Syria that have only strengthened the creation and the spread of ISIS and jihadism. Candidate Trump rightly pointed out that these policies had failed and that it was insanity to keep pursuing those policies and yet expecting a different outcome. So why is President Trump now embracing those insane policies that, if continued, will undoubtedly leave another power vacuum in the Middle East, which will be filled by jihadis? That's Reality Check. Let's talk about it right now on Twitter and Facebook.